It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
It was 30 years ago this week that the impossible goal of putting a man on the moon was realized. Apollo 11 was the mission that gave a new hope to a country in desperate need of heroes after a turbulent decade. The 3 men aboard the flight would fill that need for generations to come: Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins.
Lights on. Forward. Forward. 40 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust. Make shadow. 4 forward. Drifting to the right a little. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful from here, Neil. It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here.
It has been more than 25 years since the last man set foot on the moon. Successive administrations, both Republican and Democrat, have been reluctant to fund manned missions, and there has been no groundswell of public support for such programs either. But NASA continues with pursuits like the shuttle program, which was supposed to have a historic launch today. Unfortunately, this first mission to be headed by a woman was once again delayed, this time by the weather. There are only 12 men who have walked on the surface of the moon. I am pleased to have with me the man who was second and part of that first historic landing. You know him. He is Buzz Aldrin. Welcome to this program, sir. Great to
Nice to be here with you, Charlie.
Congratulations on all that took place in Washington at the White House on the 30th anniversary.
It was a very fascinating week, very interesting.
I want to talk about that, but first let's talk about the delay. Give me a sense of what it means to the program, what it means to the astronauts, who has that decision to call off a mission, and what the countervailing pressures are.
Well, the launch director has the ultimate decision down there at Kennedy Space Center, but he's getting information from all different sources, and many of them are prompted by automatic readouts of the conditions. And I'm sure that 3 days ago, that was the reason that an automatic readout came up indicating an abnormally high level of hydrogen in a particular engine section. And when they get down to that point in the countdown, there was, I'm sure, a mission rule that said that if that reading exists, you need to scrub the mission. And that's why that mission was scrubbed 3 days ago. Now, this one was because of weather, and there's a launch window. You need to launch not before a certain time, but not after a time, and it has to do with the mission. And in this case, it's the orbit that they would get into for the use of the telescope, the Chandra telescope that was going into a highly elliptic orbit. So there's a certain launch window. Now, if the weather is not appropriate for launch, and really it's not the weather going up that is the concern, but if there's a problem during the launch where the spacecraft, the orbiter, has to return back to the launch site. It's called Return to Launch Site, RTLS. Then you need to have weather that is appropriate for this kind of an emergency contingency landing. You need that weather that's acceptable at the skid strip at Kennedy Launch Site.
So you got to have weather going up and weather allowing for failure.
But you can go through the weather going up. That's not a problem.
Allowing weather for failure is the thing that makes a difference.
Unless, like Pete Conrad's Apollo 12, which we heard a lot about because of the sadness of his accident and funeral on Monday. But he had a very harrowing experience on the launch in November, coming up 30 years ago on Apollo 12.
What does it do to the astronaut to be ready to go? Launch is called off. get back in there, launch is called off? I mean...
Well, hopefully it doesn't make them gun-shy of a launch by having that happen several times, or crying wolf or whatever. You build on up. There's a whole psychological approach to the launch where you're preparing yourself mentally with the knowledge, physically, of course, and conditioning, but psychologically for the events leading up to a launch in the early morning or whenever it happens to be. And we've gone through a lot of simulated practice launches where after the launch gets going, you reset back to the starting point. But once you get on the real launch pad, there's no resetting back to the launch pad if there's a problem or a hold. And we don't, in the real launch, as we get the countdown going, we sort of facetiously say we don't want to have to reset back. Because you have to psychologically go through all of that preparation again. And once you've gone through something once, I just sort of have a feeling that the chances are the next couple of times you go over it, not only as the crew, but maybe other people are maybe not quite as alert because it's the second or third time.
Yeah. Tell me one essential quality that an astronaut has to have in order to be good.
I think you have to have patience and control of emotions. So many times this last week, people have asked me, little people, were you scared? And, a 6 or 8 year old's definition of scared is a little bit different than a 39-year-old's after you've gone through a lot of training and you're on the top of that Saturn V. We know that we have to have faith in other people's performance, that team that put all of this together. And we know, let's say from flying airplanes, that things can happen, and where it relies on the human being, that human being, in many cases, has to have very clear-headed reactions and not to be precipitous and to jump to the wrong conclusion. Many times in spaceflight, a problem like the Apollo 13 problem could be aggravated, made significantly worse by precipitous action by the crew to try and find out what's going on. The best thing in many cases is not to do anything. The exception, of course, is during the critical phases of launch, where if it's necessary to abort a launch, and you have that ability, a lot of times your survival may depend on your actions to get away from the explosion, the fireball. That, of course, was the case with Mercury, with the escape tower, the Gemini program. We had ejection seats, and there's an interesting story about Gemini 6, where Wally Schirra coolly did not eject when there were indications right at the last minute that maybe he should have. Apollo, of course, had an escape tower.
He didn't because he
didn't want to eject.
And so he resisted what otherwise, if he had have ejected, everybody would have said perfectly understandable.
No, there'd have been a reevaluation, as there always is.
Oh, I see. This clearly changed your life, this anniversary you're celebrating, going up there. Tell me about how you feel now when you look back at it, and if you've gone through this week of celebration. What do you want to? What do you want to be remembered for?
I'm a very productive person now, I think. A very creative, imaginative person. And it is in areas that I feel have significance to our future. And it's based on my experience. And it's based upon that pedestal status, that celebrity status that came to us in great good fortune. A lot of people could have been at the rotation sequence to have been involved in the first lunar landing. There's stories behind that. But anyway, we were the ones that were given that opportunity. And we came from different paths. I came from a path that was not test pilot training, but it was more academic. I had combat in Korea, and I served with Ed White, who was a West Pointer,
right,
along with me, and very instrumental in getting me, inspiring me to get into the astronaut program. But my path was more toward the creative, the imaginative, the contributions there. And as those contributions enabled me to get into the space program, it came in from a different path. So I'm so thankful for the opportunities that came along and this other quality that I think is very important, and that is to go through life not with a narrow approach and a preconceived notion, but cut a wide swath, pick up as many opportunities as come along, and then select the ones that are appropriate. Sometimes those opportunities select you. For example, I was at West Point, and I tried out for a Rhodes Scholarship. I stood high in my class, but I didn't have the credentials that the Rhodes Scholarship people were looking for. I tried again just before going over to Korea. My life would have been entirely different had I gone down the path of being a Rhodes Scholar.
If you'd gone to Oxford rather than Korea.
There wasn't a choice of either or. I was going to go to Oxford maybe after.
Okay, you'd gone to Korea first and then go to Oxford. You spent how many hours there on the moon?
We were on the surface of the moon a little over 20 hours. 20. We were outside,
right,
two and a half hours.
20 hours. Did you sleep at all?
We probably could have. The flight plan said that we were going to sleep first and then go outside, but we knew that would be very difficult to do, to try and sleep and then know that in a few hours when you wake up you're going to go outside on the surface. But we wanted it that way so that if we changed the flight plan to have the sleep period later, I think you understand what I mean. Yeah. We wanted it to be a positive movement. And we felt, I guess, that if we were outside moving around, we come back in again, there would be a relief and we might sleep better. Things worked out fine except for the temperature control problem. Right. It got very cold in there. See, we depressurized to go outside. We got back in again, and we got hooked up, and then we depressurized again so we could lighten the liftoff weight by throwing the backpacks and other things overboard. Our spacecraft was not as lightweight as some of the later ones, so it cost us a little bit in fuel consumption.
We have just heard about the Sapphire Memo. You're familiar with the Sapphire Memo. In other words, a speech for the president in case he had to explain to the nation why 3 men were not coming back.
Right.
Right? Right. Can you give me any insight in terms of how you psychologically prepared for the idea or figured out, I might not come back? This thing is very dicey. We got the best possible talent behind us. If it can make it, we put together a team that can make it, and we've got the best engineers and the best nautical people, but...
I was 23 years old as a second lieutenant when I faced that problem in combat, and I didn't have a big support system. I was alone in that airplane, right, and they were out to get me,
right,
okay, the other guys. That causes a person a lot more concern about not coming back when you see that last week someone didn't come back from a mission. We get used to those things. We see friends in training in pilot who have accidents and don't survive. I think we had a confidence level on that mission where personal safety was much minor to the importance of the mission we were doing. We all served our country, and serving your country means taking not an obligation, but taking it upon yourself that you'll lay down your life for your country.
Okay, when you go out on a mission as a fighter pilot, I mean, you can calculate, I mean, what the percentage of people that came back. I mean, the people who flew over Germany in World War II, they knew what percentage of the pilots they're going to lose, right?
Yeah, but you can never apply that to your particular mission.
You'll always come back. You have
it's
to
nice.
believe.
It's nice to have that attitude, but if you don't, you're not really going to be around to live with that. Other people are going to have to live with that. The demise itself is a very gentle one, probably. If you're stranded on the surface, you're just going to run out of oxygen and you're going to gradually go to sleep.
That's what happens.
Well, that's what could happen, yes. And just before you go to sleep, you're probably thinking of the last thing you could possibly do to fix that engine or whatever it is to get out of there.
You always think about how am I going to do. You don't never sort of sit down and say, it's over.
You
let me
never
figure
give up.
You never give
up.
Space program today. We don't know what the future is going to be. Mm-hmm. There's talk about private endeavors. How do you measure where we are and where we ought to go?
I think what we first have to consider is that the impetus to our space program today was the commitment to send people to the moon and bring them back safely as a response to Sputnik. And when we did that, we had an imperative to do that soon, before the Soviets could do that. So we set about taking the best talent we possibly could to accomplish that mission in the safest way, but not necessarily the cheapest way. We were willing to spend a certain amount, but what we didn't invest in is sustainability to those rockets. They were built and they're going to be thrown away. So when the program was over, or at least when we succeeded, each subsequent mission incurred the same cost or the same loss of material that could have been used again. So sooner or later you say, each mission is costing us more and more to operate and in what we throw away when we had a limited number. So we decided it was best to terminate those missions and move on to the next program. Unfortunately, in my judgment, we did not make use of some of the assets that we had. We had rocket engines in the first stage we never used again. Hydrogen rockets, rocket engines in the second and third stage, we didn't use those again. We started out over again. We defined a...
Why didn't we use them again?
I wasn't involved in those decisions then. I think we could have. I think we could have used the first stage or the second stage and maybe put wings on them in some way and had a much earlier exposure to reusability of access to space. That was the most important thing after Apollo, is to bring down the cost of access to space. It's still the most important thing that we could do, because without lessening the load on the cost, that is the big limit of almost everything. If we could bring that cost down, we'd have people going into space. I think getting people into space is the key to the future, because there are a large number of them. They want to go, they will pay to go, and where they can't afford it, my system of trying to develop lotteries will come along and spread that even out.
All right, I want to talk about what you brought here and take a look at some of this. But what is the biggest, after 30 years of the 30th anniversary of walking on the moon, what's the biggest benefit that this country has received for its exploration of space and its exploration of other planets?
I find it very hard to single that down
Give
to
me
one.
four.
Give me four. Well,
Five.
I can give. I think pride and achievement,
Self-esteem, national spirit.
yes, that was part of the purpose behind President Kennedy's, to lift our spirits after Sputnik, after the abortive Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. Right. After Yuri Gagarin flew, what can this nation do? And there was a rather hectic period of a couple of weeks before it came up that, it was only 20 days after Alan Shepard's flight that we made the commitment to go to the moon.
So what are these models we have here?
What I'm trying to do is to explain to people the easy steps to reusability, to using something over and over again. What I have here is an airplane that's combined with a rocket. This happens to be an Atlas rocket with new engines. Right. If you separate the two the way we did in early jet engines, so we could fix the engine, take it out, put it back in again. Now, this rocket is going to bring the engine, bring the rocket back. We can put one upper stage on it. We can take two of these and boost it with two using existing upper stages. These are solid rockets. This is a Centaur rocket, and this is an existing payload. What it is we do is bring back the major component of the first stage rocket. We can eventually take that same shape, build a rocket that can come back from orbital speed with external hydrogen, mate the two together. This is a next generation shuttle. All begins with the first step of reusing an existing rocket, the easiest way into reusability. This can be a demonstrator for a slightly larger size and much more powerful rocket that could replace the solid rockets on the present space shuttle. That would be a major building block for the future. That major building block will let us put up the habitat for the large number of people that could be in this. What we use to put up the habitat with one major launch is a rocket system that's mostly reusable that now will let us go back to the moon and on to Mars. So it is the reusability of rockets plus the commitment to taking people into space, either by their paying their own way as a tourist or adventure traveler, or by innovative lottery selection processes. Those are the two things that I'm working on today, because it will then enable sort of my dream, which comes from my MIT background, orbits that cycle back and forth between Earth and Mars. Those are the creativity that came out of my education and out of my experience, and I've been perfecting those in the last couple of years.
All right, but I got to go, but I'm way over. But what's the benefit of that?
The benefit of that is that inspires people to want to extend their frontiers, that enables them to participate. They've been paying for this space program for a long time. They want to go into space. They need the opportunity. We have adventure travelers like myself who go down and see the Titanic. Others climb Mount Everest, and they're willing to pay for that. They should be able to help develop this new tourism, adventure travel industry into orbit.
Buzz Aldrin, thank you for coming to the program.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us. See you next time.